But we heard Mr. Shakevich saying that they gamed the system. He was accused of having a blank form and getting it signed. He says it wasn't blank at all. It had the words "all candidates" at the top. So it might as well have been blank.
Actually, the spirit behind the long ballots is that the citizens who participated in this felt that politicians have a conflict of interest.
Limiting official agents to acting for one candidate. What are your thoughts on that type of an amendment?
That makes sense.
Do you know where I got that statement from? It's okay to say no. So this is actually grounds for a 10-minute misconduct in a game of hockey.
Oh, neat.
It's called Travesty of the Game.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
Now I'd like to welcome our witnesses for today's second panel as individuals. Louis-Philippe Sauvé, the former Member of Parliament for La Salle et Marne Verdun, and Dr. Laurie Turnbull, Professor, Faculty of Management at, this is going to pain me as someone from St. Catharines, because we say Dalhousie, but Dalhousie University. It's very painful. I want that noted on the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for being here, Mr. Sauvé and Dr. Turnbull. I have a question for you, Dr. Turnbull. You said in a recent publication about the Leader of the Opposition and the recent by-election in Battle River Crowfoot, I think that's what you're talking about. You go, Mr. Poilievre has called these actions of the Longest Ballot Committee a scam and a blatant abuse of electoral democracy, and he's right. You agreed with him. The Longest Ballot Committee's ballot hijacking has no democratic value, serves no public purpose, and stands no chance of setting up a serious conversation about electoral reform. Yet you say in that article, and as you're saying today, even though you might be disturbed by their actions, you don't think that it should compel us to change the rules. Now, I might even be convinced by that if the actions of the Longest Ballot Committee were leading to an intelligent conversation about electoral reform, but it is not. We heard Mr. Shakevich here earlier today acknowledging that what they were doing was a political prank, and he was even proud that at least one candidate got 0 votes at all. These people are not serious, and it is not leading to a serious conversation. So why wouldn't we counter this belligerence and this obstinacy and this political prank making?
So I totally agree with everything you just said. The only concern I have is the extent to which any legislative response could make life more difficult for independent candidates who are serious. Because I think, like, say, for example, we said we're going to require more signatures as a way of really testing, whether or not the candidacy is serious. I think for a political party who's someone who's running with a political party who's got that network of support, it's going to be easy for that person to meet the threshold if it was higher. But for a truly independent candidate who is serious, who wants to run to be the representative of the riding, and that's important. I don't want that person to have to pay an extra price because of the Longest Ballot Committee. That's my only concern.
Good. Well, thank you for that. One of the proposed legislative changes is exactly about that, about requiring 100 unique signatures. So, in other words, one person couldn't sign 200 nomination forms. And, getting 100 signatures is not that difficult, really, for a serious candidate, somebody who's well connected to their community. Everybody's got 10 friends who has 10 more friends, and get your 100 signatures. But we heard Mr. Shakevich saying that they gamed the system. He was accused of having a blank form and getting it signed. He says it wasn't blank at all. It had the words "all candidates" at the top. So it might as well have been blank. And so people are gaming the system, and I think that it's time for us to reform the system by making that one small rule change. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I listened with interest to the exchange between your former witness and Mr. Cooper. That was fascinating. There would be no value to having someone sign a form with no candidate's name on it. There would be equally no value of having someone sign the form with all candidates' names on it. I wasn't there, but I can't imagine that Elections Canada would find that acceptable. What are you supporting then? So as far as, this case in particular really brought to my attention this idea that people are signing multiple forms. If somebody was doing that in good faith, right? Like say if I know two people who are running for office in the same riding and I sign both their forms, if I'm doing that not as part of some grand scam, but because I believe in the viability of the candidacy of these two people, I don't think in that case that democracy is suffering for that. I'm just sort of saying, yes, these are two serious people. But if there's a coordinated effort to make sure that the same 100 signatures are standing up whoever, right, and they don't even know who they are, yeah, you know, as much as I can see the point around trying to make a rule about that.
Sure, but where do we find the balance? That was a question that Ms. Normandin asked witnesses in the previous panel. Where do we find the balance between somebody legitimately wanting to sign two candidates' forms and somebody gaming the system by signing hundreds or even dozens?
Yes. Realistically, there might not be a perfect balance there, because when you think about it, if you're going to create a rule that creates a restraint on someone else's right? For example, if you made a rule like this, you can only sign one form, then yeah, I mean, technically you're making a restriction on voters. Are there that many voters who are signing more than one form? Probably not. I don't think that's a major problem, so to the extent that that's restricting the kind of range of motion of the voter, it's probably not too heavy a restriction for most people. In fact, most people.
So a reasonable restriction on people's
I think you could make that
rights
argument.
to participate in the electoral system.
Yeah.
Good, well, thank you for that. Do I still have a minute?
You have about 40 seconds.
Okay, just quickly, I didn't have a chance to ask Mr. Shukevich any questions, but I'm really puzzled about his statements that we're in a conflict of interest to change to make the rules. In British Columbia, in my riding, we've had referendum 3 times.
Yeah.
On changing the electoral system. It was not politicians who were making the rules. There was a citizens' assembly, just like the previous witnesses said that we should have, and yet every time it was rejected. People generally appreciate the first past the post system that we have, and ultimately it was the people who made that decision. Maybe you could comment on that.
Very brief answer, Dr. Turnbull, if we can.
I think one of the reasons is that people value local representation. I've seen some evidence to suggest that when you think about larger multi-member ridings, there's some concern about that, but I'm being really brief because I know there's no time.
Actually, the spirit behind the long ballots is that the citizens who participated in this felt that politicians have a conflict of interest. And in your comments, you did sort of agree. What would you suggest as an alternative to how changes on, electoral forms are done?
So I can understand the argument that there's a conflict for the politician who's making rules or voting on rules that then help them or don't get elected, right? And I think we can look throughout history at some examples of how, say, certain political parties tend to be disadvantaged by the system we have. And so I think there's evidence to suggest that the NDP throughout history have sometimes not, sometimes they've done really well. 2011 went really well. But for some other times, that because the party's votes are distributed more thinly across the country as opposed to concentrated in a single province like the Bloc Québécois in Quebec, for example, the Bloc Québécois being regionally concentrated tends to do a little better by first past the post than the NDP would. However, if we start talking about then what do you use as opposed to the House of Commons, who else should make this decision? It's much easier to think about that in theory than it is to think about that in practice. In theory, we assemble 50 really smart people and get them, really jazzed up about electoral systems, and we put them in some kind of cone of silence where they have no conflict of interest of their own, and this is not going to be penetrated by political parties. None of this is really possible. And they spit out the right electoral system. But then what, right? There's no accountability for those people.
And is that with the assumption that most Canadians are partisan and have a political leaning?
I don't think most Canadians are. I mean, not many people are members of political parties, and I think we see a lot of promiscuity, frankly, in terms of what people do with their ballot. People jump all over the place all the time in terms of who they vote for. So I wouldn't say we're certainly not the U.S. people put it on their sleeve, the Republican or Democrat. We've never had that kind of reality or culture here.
So I'm just trying to understand. So if we're in 2025 and most democratic reforms have been done through this place, and Canadians have voted for folks who have made these changes, why the change now? Like why is there a conflict now that wasn't there before?
Well, I mean, in some ways, I think if you really pushed on the concept of conflict of interest, it becomes problematic because one could make the argument that politicians are almost always in a conflict of interest. Anything you decide it could affect you somehow, right? And so if you push it too hard, I think as a concept it's interesting to think about people who are players in the game or making the rules of the game. Like that's fair enough, and we can think about that. And there are going to be political reasons why some parties will say we're never going to change the electoral system because we like the one we have. It works for us, right? That's real. That's real. But politicians you're also accountable for the decisions you make. So you've got to face the public, whereas members of a citizens' assembly wouldn't in the same way.
I do want to get your thoughts on disinformation and public platforms such as social media platforms. What do you think is the role of governments in regulating AI, for example, AI systems around disinformation without falling into the territory of censorship and partisanship as well?
Oh, it's difficult. It's very, very difficult to think about how to put it in motion, how to operationalize a government role. I think that the most important thing is that citizens need to be able to practice civic self-defense on their own. I think there needs to be a lot of, what government can do, civic literacy, actually really give a role for people to become. I know education is provincial jurisdiction, but it's really, really important that people are able to tell.
Do you think that right now, with the level of education that that is available to the Canadian public, is enough for people to understand what is disinformation and what isn't on social media platforms?
I'm not sure about that. I think people are becoming more discerning, and unfortunately, I think we're getting to a point where sometimes we don't know if we can believe anything.
Yeah.
And we have to double and triple check everything, which maybe is that's the world we're in. I think it's really helpful for organizations that are nonpartisan, like Elections Canada, to help citizens develop that sense of you need to double and triple check to make sure, especially at election time. But it's hard to do. And we also have, for example, when we're talking about foreign interference, a lot of times you're not talking about messages that are going across the board to all Canadians and we can see them all in broad daylight. We're talking about targeted messaging at a small part of the population, which doesn't go through the filter of, CBC, CTV, like Professor Lone was talking about. Those sorts of things can be harder to detect. But I do think that the role of SITE during the campaign, for example, was performed very well. So we're not lost. We're doing some things right.
Just a few seconds left.
The chief electoral officer in his testimony stated that the purpose of the act with respect to the signing of nomination papers is that candidates need 100 signatures to endorse their candidacy, not for 100 electors to flood the ballot with an endless list of candidates. And I'm paraphrasing what the chief electoral officer said. I think you would agree with that, Madam Turnbull, Professor Turnbull. And so you earlier, I think in answer to Mr. Van Popta, said that in circumstances like we saw with the longest ballot committee, where a small group of electors were signing multiple forms with clearly the intent of creating what took place with the longest ballot committee and disrupting the electoral process, that perhaps there would be room to make amendments to the Canada Elections Act to address that. So if not limiting it to or mandating exclusive signatures or prohibiting electors from signing multiple papers, then what would be the alternative solution?
Right. I don't know. To me, it's unfortunate if we have to make a restriction, because I understand the point too. Certainly it's possible for you to want to acknowledge as an elector the validity of multiple candidates. And that in itself doesn't cause any problem to me at all if all of those candidates are real. But if it's part of an effort that is designed to, go along with the stunt sort of thing, it serves no democratic purpose. I can understand the point in wanting to make sure that voters don't end up participating in that.
Another suggestion was limiting official agents to acting for one candidate. What are your thoughts on that type of an amendment?
That makes sense. That makes total sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, Mr. Sauvé, thank you. Good to see you back here. You spoke about the disruption that occurred in terms of administering the election in LaSalle-Verdun. What about in terms of the impact that it had on voters in terms of filling out the ballot? Persons who might have certain barriers, whether it be mobility issues, literacy issues, visual impairment issues. Can you speak to that?
Bien, en fait, ça me rappelle que...
Well, in fact, your question reminds me that on early polling day, I drove one of our voters who had a visual impairment, and I drove her to the polling station. Now, we have that kind of check and balance in the electoral system, i.e. a returning officer who swears under oath that such and such is occurring. That's provided for, so I don't think it had a major impact on the outcome of the poll itself. Now, that said, when it comes to electors, well, obviously it is frustrating, but I don't think it had an effect on the outcome of the election, as my result attests to, and also the result from the Crawford Battleford River. Now, to a certain extent,
I don't think anyone is asserting that that this committee caused or impacted the overall outcome of an election, but it did create challenges for individual voters, correct?
Oui, absolument. C'est sûr que ça crée des
yes,
enjeux.
it did create challenges for individual voters, but not insurmountable challenges, to the extent that if the returning officer, in fact, factors those potential effects. Now, it's just a matter of organisation at the end of the day, making sure that things run smoothly. But in response to your question, and what I was about to get to, was that to a certain extent, it enables voters to better hone in on their choice, to know truly who they're going to vote for with certainty, because in the case of that election, my opponent from the NDP had the same family name as me. So obviously, when we were communicating with voters, we tried to stress the point that we shared the same family name. So, and we adapted in our communication strategy. I'm not saying that it's ideal, nevertheless, but in terms of the outcome, I don't think it was significant or meaningful.
When folks come to see me about this, I say to them the best way to do that is to show that the public cares. If you poll on this issue, and there's 20 issues, it's typically 18th, 19th, or 20th on the minds of Canadians. The other is you can just run candidates that are single-issue candidates that actually focus on this particular issue. On the other hand, the longest ballot committee clearly creates the potential for the frustration of voters. If you think about the lineups that actually potentially can exist in many constituencies, people will just not vote. They'll bail out of the line and they actually won't vote. So this is a tactic that actually is frustrating the democratic rights of Canadians. I hear your argument about, we don't want to put restraints or restrictions on the range of voter freedom. But I mean, in my mind, we actually already do that. We don't allow people to sign the nominations of people who live in the riding beside you. You have to live in your own riding. And so there are ways in which we have done that. And so I guess my question is, in your opinion, given that this tactic can frustrate the rights of those people who actually are serious about voting, what should we do about this if we're not prepared to put those kinds of minimal restrictions on the range of freedom? It just seems to me that the ability to sign only one nomination form is not a particularly big restriction.
Yes, I agree. I don't think it's a big restriction either. I think it's a restriction, but it's probably one that we can justify because, again, I don't think it's going to affect all that many people when it comes down to it. And I think also I want to say again that I thought that the response that Elections Canada came up with was fantastic. Write the name down. And as far as I know, in Battle River Crowfoot, there was not, there didn't seem to be any problem with that. There was no big concern around, more spoiled ballots or something like that. It seems like that kind of went okay. And so if it's possible for Elections Canada to pivot in those sorts of circumstances, and if this tactic is tried again, they can say, well, we're just not going to print a big long ballot. People are going to write in the name. And that's it.
I'm just going to read a statement to you, Professor Turnbull, and I want you to tell me if you think that the intentions or the motivations of the longest ballot committee would meet this definition. A mockery, distortion, or gross misrepresentation that disrespects or undermines the spirit, rules, or integrity of the contest.
I'm so sorry. Can you say it again?
A mockery, distortion, or gross misrepresentation that disrespects or undermines the spirit, rules, or integrity of the contest.
I definitely agree with the mockery part. I think the fact that there's, yes, I think so. Yeah, because the initial phrasing is or, isn't it? Doesn't have to meet all three of those things.
That's right.
So, yes.
Do you know where I got that statement from? It's okay to say no. So this is actually grounds for a 10-minute misconduct in a game of hockey.
Oh, neat.
It's called travesty of the game.
I like that.
Okay. And to my knowledge, there's nothing in our Elections Act that actually has any clause in it like this. If you make a travesty as a player, as a coach, whatever the case might be, even as a fan, there's a consequence of behaving that way. And I'm wondering, given the fact that we've lost the ability to at least put a barrier in front of unserious people by having a non-refundable deposit. We lost that in 2017 with that Alberta court decision that wasn't appealed. And given the testimony that you've given us in regards to whether or not you think changing the process for getting people to sign nomination papers might not have the desired outcome, I'm left wondering what we could possibly do. But I can tell you, I am in the riding right next door to Battle River Crowfoot in Alberta, and I heard more from my constituents during the by-election about how ridiculous and ashamed and embarrassed the voters in my constituency were of what was transpiring in the by-election right next door as a result of having over 200 names on the ballot. And the words they used were things like travesty, or they even surmised even greater nefarious motives behind that movement than what the individual who just testified here actually said. Do you think it's possible to craft a piece of a part of the legislation that would actually be enforceable? And who would be the adjudicator of whether or not somebody is making a mockery, distortion, or gross misrepresentation of our elections?
Right. So yes, I think. So first of all, I really like this line of argument in terms of trying to put something in the legislation that protects the integrity of elections, because I think we're in a number of ways the integrity of elections is tested, and we have to find ways for the public to be protected, which is really what it's about. It's about protecting the public's ability to choose the representatives in a way that is not taken over by these sorts of campaigns that actually have nothing to do with the vote on the ballot in that particular riding. So I think there's a way for language to be crafted so that it's not going too far. I think that's the key. If you make it too heavy, if you make it the range too far, then it will be too much, like overlap, like kind of too much of a restriction on rights and things like that, and then that'll be struck down. As far as who makes the decision, I mean, I can see that landing in court if people are, I think that's probably where it would end up.
Just so you know, you went 4 minutes, 20 seconds.
I'll be very quick, Chair. Just to summarize, because I agree that we've probably given this too much time, this farce, to be honest, and the individual is pleased that they got 0% or 0 votes in a constituency which got international headlines. But we do need to have an outcome out of this. So to summarize your position, you do not support the restriction of signatures to only being able to sign one candidate's paper, but you would support a change that one official agent can only be the official agent for one candidate anywhere in the country. Is that a clear statement of your position?
Absolutely yes on the official agent piece. And on the second part, I wish we didn't have to do it. I wish we didn't have to restrict signatures because I just think that for the reasons I've said, but I'll live with it. I wouldn't say you got it wrong if you decided that you're going to go that way. I understand.
Okay, thank you very much.